Okay, today we're going to be changing the grease on a Kitchenaid Professional 5 Plus, and what you want to notice is there's a screw right in the back. We're going to take that out. It's going to expose 4 screws to remove the lid. So I'll take the band off and then the screws out. So let's get started. Screw number 1, and I've got a real long bit because I'm going to need that later. And the reason I have a box is to put my parts in, if you see the box there. 2 screws on this side, 2 screws on the other side. Now I do like to keep my screws together. You're going to see there's other screws later on in the video. Alright, so I'm going to open this up. I don't know if this is going to catch or not, so I just opened it up and then it just lifts right off. I'm not sure if that catch right there catches on the lip, but anyway, just to make sure there are no issues, I did that. Put it aside. I'll probably keep my dirty parts in the box and the clean parts over here on the side. So this is the area in question, and in case you didn't know about grease, it's just oil in like a medium, let's just say paraffin, for lack of details on the food grade grease we're going to put in there. What happens is over time the oil, gravity just gets a hold of the oil and it'll eventually just drip out and you have to replace it. This one is 12 years old, so it lasted 12 years on this one. So I have some black nitrile gloves, and they're different from the blue ones. The blue ones have a tendency to be susceptible to the chemicals that will degrease the metal parts, and so I use the black nitrile. They hold up better to the chemicals I use to degrease the parts with. Okay, there are 4 screws to remove from the transmission box here where all the gears are. This one over here by the circuit board is the one that's most tricky. Also, the shaft goes straight up here and it's resting here, so it might be a little awkward to get it out. I could take the circuit board off and set it to the side. That's one thing I could do, but we'll see. I might move it during the cleaning. So this is the reason for my long extension here. It's just this one screw. Okay, and this should lift straight up, and just had to move it a little bit to get it up and over the post. And then I will take the screws out and separate those from the other screws. So the first thing we want to do is we want to take this clip off of here. So we just take the snap ring off, clean that up. Well, with the snap ring off, the gear just comes right off. It's keyed. I'll show you better when it cleans up. But what I mean by keyed is there's this pin here, and that has to be centered to fit onto this gear. So we'll take the pin out, then we'll lift this other gear up and out. Alright, with the clip off, you can just take the bottom off. Just work it through like that. This gear just comes right off. As soon as you take the clip off, you can remove the bottom on the professional model. And you take this piece off. Alright, that'll leave the grease pit and the motor all in place. We don't need to worry about that too much, and I'll just clean it up as best I can. Okay, so here's our parts layout. I'll go over it real quick. Again, I recommend taking digital pictures before, during, and after you take things apart, especially when it's all greasy and gooey and everything. Your hands are going to be a mess, and you're not going to be paying attention too much. And as you can see, for example, there's all different size washers, you know, where do they go, and all that kind of stuff is going to pop into your head during reassembly, and if you assemble it incorrectly, you'll hear noise, it will not fit well, it'll be force fit, and you can just mess things up. So anyway, we'll go over the parts. And one other thing is hardware. Keep your hardware straightened out so you know where everything goes. This is to put the bottom unit. This is the top unit over here. Put the bottom unit on the stand, and this is control board, this is the gearbox housing. You just need to know your hardware and where it goes, because typically they are different, and you could probably figure it out if you forgot, didn't label it, didn't understand it. That's all okay, because sometimes you can see that this large screw is not going to go where this small screw goes. So anyway, pay attention to your hardware also. Okay, we will start with the planetary gear. This planetary gear will go into the bottom housing like this. The thick part goes up, the thin part is down, such that it will go in. There's the slot for the keyway. It'll go in like this. Very easily and gently work it in, and it should just slide right in place. You see I'm working it in. It just goes in nice and easy, and you can see how much further I have to go. It'll fit right down on top of this plateau here, and that'll be the planetary gear. Okay, once in place, we'll set that aside. Now let's look at the base unit. As you can see, I didn't take this out. There's like a force fit in there. There's really no need to do that. So what's going to go in here is the gearing. So you see you have like this stainless steel clip. You have your main post. This is a force fit, so I didn't drive it out and put it back in. You have a keyway. Again, I didn't even take that out. So this is going to ride up in here. Well, first of all, I'm going to go like this. This is going to ride up in here. Then we have the smaller one on top. Then we have the pin. Then we have the gear. You see how it's keyed toward the pin. And then the clip on top. This large, almost paper-like washer is going to go right here like this. All the way down. It's an O-ring right there. I didn't remove it. And then that goes up into the unit here like that. So I'm going to grease that up, put it together, and we'll be ready to go. Okay, we're all greased up and ready to go back together. Now what I want to say about greasing is I've really saturated in between the gears there, and the first time that the mesh gears go around, everything is going to be pushed out of the way except for the tolerance gap. So there's no need to put tons of grease in there, because it's all going to be squished out of the way, and then you're only going to have a thin coating applying for future use. So all you need is, I think even this is overkill, but anyway, that's what I do with gearing. So I'll put a little bit there in the middle for the shaft, and this bottom piece will be ready to go. Alright, we're ready to mount the plate, and you notice I don't have it assembled yet, and that is because a C-clip holds the whole unit on there, and I'm going to be doing that later. So we have some guide pins here. We'll put this on, and we'll put our large screws in place, and then we will work on the electricals. Okay, with the top plate mounted, next is the electricals, and what you want to notice, you have your plugs that go into your circuit board. That's from the power unit, and then a ground. So what we're going to do is we're going to reattach the ground, set our plug, and then the motor is still attached to the circuit board, and then we'll plug these guys in. Now you can notice the shape, and you'll see that the shape matches the back of the unit here, and that's how it'll plug in. It's not round, so it should be pretty easy to match it up. So what you want to notice is I've started the screws, but I haven't screwed them all the way in, and I needed to lift that up. We'll set the electrical in place and then finish mounting the bottom. Or you can hold the electrical in place and mount the bottom. That's all good. Okay, I decided to film it in case you're not used to seeing these kinds of things. There's a little cutout right here. Looks like a plus sign or something, maybe a cross. And that's for the wiring to slide up into. See how it just popped into place? It's because there's a cutout for it, and you put it in through the bottom. Then you set this down, put your screws in, and it's captured. See how the wiring is captured? Again, this is where taking pictures before you take things apart comes into play. Okay, I have my electrical wiring out of the way. I haven't connected the ground gear yet. I have the drive gear on the end of the motor greased up, and we'll just set the motor in place, and then we'll bolt it down. If you're worried about dropping or losing the screws, what you can do is you can put your screws in like this, and then when you set your motor in place, the screw will already be in position, and you can start it then. Okay, I have the motor connected to the circuit board. I have the speed sensor reconnected. I have the ground connected. So we gotta have our motor, circuit board, ground all reconnected. Now we're back over to the main event, the grease area, and you really only need to grease the contact points. I know it was like really smashed and gooped in there when you first saw the initial cleaning, and we will goop it up pretty good, but initially you really don't need to pile it on, because all of the contact areas where the gearing meshes, all that grease is going to be thrown out of the way except for the tolerance gaps, and all that grease is just going to sit there. So gravity will, bring the grease back in a little bit, and then it'll be pushed out of the way, and then gravity will bring the grease back in a little bit and be pushed out of the way, but it's very, very minor. Okay, I have the planetary gear greased up and the top gear greased up, so we're ready to assemble our planetary gear. Now the planetary gear will be held in place because the top gear is actually sort of a force fit as you put it on. So what I'm going to do is run the shaft through and line up the bottom gearing. Oops, you can't see that. Let me zoom out. So I'll put the shaft through, line up the bottom gearing, and then put the top gear on. So let's get that up in there. And there we go. Top gear on. And what you're going to notice is it just kind of stops right there. It's kind of tight. There you go. Pops in place. Now that's all going to hold together. Alright, similar to the planetary gear, there's a pin, and notice that it's going to line up with the bottom of the top bevel gear that goes on here. So we'll put in our pin, get it about halfway through, even on both sides, and then this will slide on top. Alright, we'll set our top gear in place here. should line up. I think I'll leave this here because it goes into the top of the transmission, so we'll just let that stay there. Make sure everything's all greased up. Alright, we'll put our top clip on. I didn't film it because my hand would have been in the way, but the top clip is on. Next I want to talk about the transmission gear. This is the drive gear that the motor is connected to, and it will drive the planetary gear. So let me show you how that goes together. So this is where details are important. This is the rear bearing. It's a bushing, but technically it's a bearing. Just because it doesn't have rollers on it, like a roller bearing like this one, doesn't mean it's not a bearing. So that's what that is. So this is the rear bearing. So if the front of the machine is going this way, this goes on the rear by the gear that goes to the motor pinion. And the way it sets in the housing, it'll only go on one way. You know, you won't be able to put it on this way because that slot won't fit in the groove that's in there. You'll see. This is the front bearing, or the front bushing, however you want to call it. And this is your roller bearing over here. And what I want you to note is that these are not flat washers. See how that has a groove in it? And it's flat on this side. This one has a groove in it. It's flat on this side. Also, the ball bearings technically have two sides, but it isn't going to matter whether it goes on this way or this way. So we'll grease those up, put it together. Be sure that you put in the races correctly. So the grooves hold the ball bearing. Grooves hold the ball bearing. So it's going to go together like this. So we'll grease all that up and install it. Okay, the transmission gearing is going to go right in here like this. It's going to connect the motor to the planetary gear housing. So that's going to go in there. And what I mean by the bushings, they are only going to go on one way. They only fit in position one way. You won't be able to put it in like this and get everything to fit. And you won't be able to put this one over here and get everything to fit. So that's how that works. So I will grease everything up and put it in. So before I grease everything up and hide it, it's going to be bushing, gear, bearing washer, bearing washer, assembled correctly, and then the bushing on the other side, and then that's going to sit right in place here. So let's grease it up and put it in. Okay, I'll know in editing if I misspoke, but here's the rear bearing. That is the one that is has a little extension beyond the alignment tab. So we have the bearing surface and the bushing, the alignment tab, and a little shoulder. Then the gearing, then the bearing, which you can barely see if you can see it at all, and then the front bushing set in place. So that's how it all goes. And the reason I left this on top was because that is going to sit up in here when we put our piece back on, our transmission cover back on. That is going to sit up in there, so I want some lubricant on top and let it squish down the sides onto the contact area. I'm also going to put some grease in there and cap it off too. Also have the front driver, which I still need to put in. We don't ever use it. I thought about leaving it out because of noise, but I mean, I don't like that. But anyway, I'm going to reinstall it. It's no big deal. So here is the front cap. I'm going to grease it up and install it. It's going to go in like this. That square driver, you know, is your meat grinder or whatever attachments you can buy, and we don't have any attachments. We have other devices that we use. We don't use our mixer for doing other things besides mixing. So it's really a useless piece of equipment. Really don't need it. Okay, so we're all greased up, ready to go. I have the housing greased up too, the front drive gear and the post mount, the bearing area for the post mount. And you can see how much grease I have left over. Now, remember from the very beginning of the video, it was just piled on with grease here. And from an engineering point of view, and I was also a valve technician for many years before I got my degree, I don't know why all of that grease is there. Like I said, maybe gravity will push some of the grease down into the gearing, and then when it starts up, it's flung out except for the gap in the tolerance areas. So it may be for noise, I don't know. So I'm going to reassemble it. I can always take it apart and pack it full of grease again, but right now this is what I'm going to do. I am just going to reassemble this. And another thing I'd like to point out is you can put your screw in place and then set the transmission housing onto the blender. And the reason I would put at least this screw in place is because of the circuit board. It's really in the way. So you have to kind of wiggle it in place. To get everything lined up, you got to get around stuff and whatnot, and then get the shaft in place so it'll slide down the rest of the way, because it has to be straight. So anyway, that screw is kind of a pain to get in there. You might drop it and have to fish it out. So the other screws are real easy. But anyway, that's a little trick if you want to use it. See how I did that little twisting motion? Because if you try and go straight down, the circuit board's in the way. So you can use that little twisting trick, and then I have my screw already in place. We can get started and screw the transmission housing in place. And remember, my other trick is you start all the screws before you tighten any one down. That way you know everything's aligned correctly. All right, put the cover back on. Have our 4 screws. Start all 4 before finishing up. And we put our band on. And we have a tiny little screw that goes on the back here. You can see how it goes. You see this one sits flat and this one goes on top. So you can see that there is actually a left and right, top and bottom, if you will. Okay, we're reassembled. It's time for the smoke test. Thanks for watching.